17 men accepted food from two sisters in the Ozark wilderness. Only one survived. When authorities finally raided their cabin, they found a journal documenting every victim, 11 bodies buried in the woods, and a hidden chamber where starving men were chained and subjected to weeks of torture. The sisters showed zero remorse. Their defense at trial: "We only did to men what men have always done to women." This is the true story of the Kincaid sisters, one of the first documented cases of female serial predation in American history. By the end of this video, you'll understand how isolation, trauma, and opportunity created monsters that hid in plain sight for 6 years. If you're fascinated by the darkest chapters of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature, hit that subscribe button now, because we document cases like this that most people will never hear about. And drop a comment telling me, do you think evil is born or created by circumstance? Now let's go back to 1891. The winter of 1891 descended on the Ozark Mountains of Stone County, Missouri, with a ferocity that old-timers would speak of for decades. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero in late October and remained there for weeks, freezing the White River solid enough that men could walk across its surface. 3 logging camps along the river system found themselves cut off when the first blizzard struck earlier than anyone predicted, blocking mountain passes with snow drifts that reached 15 feet deep and making the narrow trails completely impassable. The camps had been stocked for a normal winter, but with supply lines severed 2 months earlier than expected, over 60 men faced the prospect of starvation. By December, the men were consuming meals that barely qualified as sustenance, boiling pine bark to create a thin soup, chewing on leather belts and bootlaces to give their stomachs something to work on, watching each other's faces grow gaunt as flesh melted away from bones. The psychological toll proved as devastating as the physical deterioration. Men who had worked together for years began eyeing each other with the calculating assessment of predators, recognizing that survival might require choices no civilized person should contemplate. Some loggers spoke openly about abandoning the camps to seek help, though everyone understood that traveling through the frozen wilderness in weakened condition meant almost certain death. Into this nightmare of desperation and failing hope, word arrived through a trapper who had stumbled into one of the camps seeking shelter. He spoke of 2 sisters who operated a homestead 5 miles deeper into the mountains, women who maintained abundant food stores and welcomed travelers with Christian charity. The Kincaid sisters, he said, never turned away a hungry man, asked no payment for meals, and had sheltered him for 3 days during a brutal storm. The information spread through all 3 camps within days. Desperate men began to believe in salvation that required only a 5-mile journey through frozen wilderness to a cabin where hot food and kindness waited. The Kincaid homestead had stood in its hidden hollow since 1872. Built by a man named Jeremiah Kincaid, the property sat in a natural depression surrounded by limestone cliffs that rose 65 feet on 3 sides, creating a bowl-shaped valley where sound behaved strangely, failing to carry beyond the rock walls. Accessing the hollow required following a narrow game trail that wound through dense forest for over 2 miles. A path so obscure that travelers often missed it entirely unless they knew exactly where to look. When Jeremiah died in 1886 under circumstances the county never properly investigated, his daughters Delilah and Esther inherited the 140 acres, along with their father's reputation for violent temperament. The sisters were 28 and 26 respectively at the time of his death, both unmarried despite being considered handsome by the few neighbors who occasionally encountered them. By 1891, the Kincaid sisters had operated their homestead independently for 5 years, maintaining the subsistence farming and hunting their father had established. They cultivated an extensive medicinal herb garden that provided remedies they traded to trappers and loggers. And their root cellar was legendary, stocked with smoked venison, preserved vegetables, dried fruits, and salted fish that represented years of careful preparation. The sisters had cultivated a specific reputation. They were known as Christian women who read scripture daily and believed in the duty of charity toward those in need. Travelers who stopped at their cabin universally reported generous hospitality, hot meals served without expectation of payment, and genuine concern for men struggling to survive in the brutal Ozark wilderness. But beneath this carefully maintained image existed patterns that a more connected community might have recognized as troubling. Jail. The sisters showed particular interest in solitary travelers, men who mentioned having no family expecting them, men who were passing through with no fixed destination. They asked detailed questions about where visitors had come from, where they intended to go, and whether anyone knew their current location. The cabin itself reflected this dual nature. The main room was welcoming, with comfortable furniture and religious verses carved into the wooden beams. But the structure also contained unusual features: heavy doors with iron reinforcements, windows fitted with interior shutters that could be barred from inside, and ceiling beams embedded with iron rings whose purpose visitors rarely questioned. Curtis Bramwell left the Wilson Creek logging camp on December 14, 1891. At 34 years old, Bramwell was one of the more experienced loggers, a man who knew the mountain trails well enough to navigate them even in winter conditions. He carried a letter from his foreman requesting assistance for 32 starving men. The journey should have required 6 hours of steady travel. Bramwell's plan was simple: reach the cabin by evening, explain the camp's desperate situation, secure provisions, and return the following day with enough food to keep his companions alive. He arrived at the Kincaid cabin just after dusk, exhausted from the difficult trek. Delilah answered his knock, her face showing immediate concern when he explained the situation. She welcomed him inside, where warmth from the massive fireplace hit him like a physical force. Esther appeared from the back room, and both sisters insisted he sit near the fire while they prepared a hot meal. The food they served was more abundant than anything Bramwell had eaten in weeks. Venison stew thick with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread still warm from the oven, dried apple pie sweetened with honey. The sisters encouraged him to eat his fill, explaining they had plenty to share. They mixed him a tea from herbs in their garden, claiming it would restore his strength and help him sleep soundly. Bramwell remembered feeling grateful for their kindness, as drowsiness overtook him with unexpected speed. The sisters helped him to a bed in their guest quarters, their voices soothing as they assured him that everything would be arranged by morning. He fell asleep thinking about the relief his return would bring to the starving men at camp. When a week passed without Bramwell's return, 2 loggers from the camp made the journey to the Kincaid homestead. They found the sisters welcoming and concerned, expressing surprise that Bramwell had not returned to camp as promised. Delilah explained that he had indeed visited, consumed a substantial meal, rested overnight, and departed the following morning, headed east toward the settlement of Galena with supplies they had provided. She seemed genuinely puzzled by his failure to return, suggesting perhaps he had decided to seek help from town authorities rather than attempting the dangerous journey back to the isolated camp. The explanation made logical sense. Bramwell had been clear about his intentions, but the sisters' sincerity and the hot food they provided made questioning their account seem ungrateful. The loggers accepted provisions, spent a single night in the cabin, and returned to their camp the next morning. They never realized how narrowly they had escaped sharing Bramwell's fate. Raymond Aldrich had managed timber operations across Missouri for 12 years, and his success came from obsessive attention to detail. In February 1893, while reviewing financial records at the company's Springfield office, he noticed something troubling. 6 loggers from different camps had failed to collect final wages owed to them, amounts ranging from $12 to $43 that represented weeks of brutal labor. Aldrich understood something fundamental about the men who worked timber operations. They might abandon dangerous work, they might disappear to avoid debts, but they never walked away from earned wages. The pattern that emerged made his skin prickle. Every missing logger had been working camps along the White River system during the brutal winter of 1891 and 1892. 3 had vanished from Wilson Creek Camp, 2 from operations near Elijah, 1 from a smaller outfit near Reed Spring. All 6 had last been seen heading toward the same general area, a remote section of wilderness that contained a single permanent residence. The Kincaid homestead. Aldrich expanded his investigation, writing letters to families and visiting settlements to interview anyone with information. Curtis Bramwell's wife in Springfield had received no word from her husband in 14 months and assumed he died in the mountains, though his body had never been found. A trapper named William Dirth had mentioned to his brother that he planned to stop at the Kincaid cabin for supplies, then disappeared completely. 2 Finnish immigrants had told companions they were seeking the generous sisters who provided food to hungry travelers. Neither had been seen again. Most troubling was the testimony Aldrich gathered from men who had visited the Kincaid homestead and survived. Their accounts were universally positive, describing the sisters as kind, charitable women, but certain details repeated with uncomfortable consistency. The sisters always served tea made from their medicinal herbs. They expressed particular interest in men who were alone. They encouraged visitors to rest longer than originally planned. Several survivors mentioned feeling unusually drowsy after meals at the cabin, attributing it to exhaustion and the warmth of the fire. One trapper recalled waking from a deep sleep with no memory of going to bed, finding himself in the guest quarters with vague recollections of the sisters helping him to the room. These men had laughed about their weakness, never considering that their drowsiness might have been induced rather than natural. Pause here for a moment. Would you have accepted food from the sisters if you were starving in that winter? Drop a comment and let me know. What Raymond Aldrich could not have known was that the horror at the Kincaid homestead had roots extending back long before the starvation winter. The true beginning lay in 1886, when Jeremiah Kincaid died from what his daughters reported as a hunting accident, a shotgun blast to the chest. No one questioned the account because no one wanted to make the difficult journey to investigate a death in a place most people had never heard of. Jeremiah Kincaid had moved his family to the Hidden Hollow when his daughters were children, deliberately choosing isolation that made outside interference impossible. For 18 years, he had ruled the homestead with absolute authority, and what happened in that isolated bowl surrounded by limestone cliffs stayed there, hidden by geography and the shame that kept his daughters silent. The abuse had been systematic and comprehensive, teaching Delilah and Esther that men were fundamentally weak despite their physical strength. That power came not from muscle, but from control. When they finally killed their father, shooting him while he slept and dragging his body into the woods, the sisters discovered something that should have horrified them, but instead felt like liberation. The death brought not guilt, but a sense of power they had never experienced. The realization that they could take from men what had been taken from them, that they could inflict the helplessness they had endured, and that their isolated homestead provided perfect conditions to explore impulses that had festered in darkness for years. Silas Moffett was a trapper who had worked the Ozark wilderness for 11 years, a man accustomed to solitude and capable of surviving conditions that killed less experienced woodsmen. In late January 1893, he made the mistake of accepting hospitality at the Kincaid cabin after a severe storm left him soaked and dangerously close to hypothermia. The sisters welcomed him with their characteristic warmth, providing dry clothes, hot food, and the medicinal tea they offered to every visitor. Moffett remembered feeling grateful as drowsiness overtook him. Then nothing, until he woke in complete darkness, with his wrists and ankles shackled to a stone wall. The root cellar where he found himself confined was perhaps 12 feet square, carved partially into the hillside behind the cabin and reinforced with timber supports. No light penetrated except when the trap door above opened. The air carried smells of earth, mold, and human waste that suggested previous occupants. Moffett spent his first hours testing the chains, finding them securely anchored into limestone with no possibility of breaking free through force alone. When the trap door finally opened, Delilah descended the ladder, carrying a lantern and a bowl of thin soup. What followed was a cycle that repeated for nearly 4 weeks. The sisters kept him perpetually hungry, providing just enough food to maintain life, but never enough to restore strength. They alternated between visits, sometimes Delilah alone, sometimes Esther, occasionally both together. Each visit brought new degradations that combined sexual abuse with psychological torture, designed to break his will completely. Delilah would speak in maternal tones while inflicting pain, creating disorienting confusion between comfort and cruelty. Esther remained mostly silent, watching with cold intensity that suggested she was studying his responses like a naturalist observing a specimen. The sisters seemed to derive particular satisfaction from forcing him to beg for food, making him perform increasingly humiliating acts in exchange for scraps that barely qualified as meals. They asked him repeatedly whether he had family waiting for him. When he lied, claiming a wife in Springfield who would report him missing, they laughed. Why told him that dozens of men had made similar claims, and none had ever been found. The statement terrified him more than the physical abuse because it revealed the scope of what he had stumbled into. This was not aberrant behavior, but refined practice. Moffett survived partly through luck and partly through careful observation. The sisters drank their own medicinal tea each evening before retiring. On nights when they consumed larger amounts, their morning visits came later, and their attention to security details became careless. On his 26th day of captivity, after a night when he heard the sisters laughing loudly in the cabin before everything went quiet, he discovered that the manacle securing his right wrist had not been fully tightened. It took 3 hours of slow, painful work to twist his hand through the iron cuff, tearing skin and dislocating his thumb in the process. Once free, he used a loose stone from the cellar floor to break the remaining chains from the wall anchors, weakened by rust that suggested the chamber had held many previous occupants. He climbed the ladder, found the cabin empty with both sisters sleeping in their bedroom, and fled into the frozen wilderness wearing only the ragged clothes he had been confined in. The journey to the nearest logging camp took 30 hours of desperate travel through terrain he barely recognized, suffering from exposure, starvation, and injuries that should have killed him. When he finally stumbled into the camp, delirious and nearly frozen, the loggers who found him initially thought he was raving mad. His testimony about weeks of captivity and systematic abuse seemed too extreme to be credible. If you're still watching, comment a number between 1 and 17 right now. This is important for what comes next. Raymond Aldrich brought Silas Moffat to the Stone County Sheriff's Office in Galena on March 23, 1893. He carried documentation he had compiled over months of investigation alongside a survivor, whose physical condition suggested trauma consistent with prolonged captivity. Sheriff Lucas Thorne was 56 years old, a man who had maintained law and order in the county for 12 years. The request to investigate two isolated women based on what seemed like an incredible story tested his willingness to intrude on family privacy that mountain culture considered sacred. But Aldrich's evidence was methodical and compelling. 6 loggers with unclaimed wages, multiple reports of men vanishing after visiting the Kincaid homestead, and now a survivor with injuries that the county physician confirmed were consistent with restraints, malnutrition, and systematic abuse. Moffat's wrists and ankles bore scarring from manacles. His body showed signs of torture that could not have been self-inflicted. His psychological state suggested trauma that went beyond anything winter hardship could explain. Thorne interviewed Moffat extensively, pressing for details. The trapper described the cellar's dimensions, the specific placement of chains in the walls, the sisters' routine of visits and feeding schedules. His testimony remained consistent across multiple questioning sessions. Most convincing was Moffat's emotional state when describing his captivity, showing genuine fear rather than the performance someone fabricating a story would display. Thorne spent 2 weeks planning the approach. He recruited Deputy Samuel Corrigan, arranged for Dr. Marcus Webb to accompany the party, and brought Aldrich, whose persistence had made the investigation possible. The party departed Galena on April 6, 1893, following the logging road north before turning onto the obscure trail that led to the Hidden Hollow. The journey required careful navigation through terrain that seemed designed to discourage visitors. They reached the edge of the hollow by mid-afternoon, stopping to observe the property from a concealed position. The cabin looked peaceful, smoke rising from the chimney, chickens scratching in a yard, laundry hanging on a line between 2 trees. Nothing about the scene suggested horror. But Aldrich pointed out details that supported Moffat's testimony: the heavy construction of the cabin's door, the iron-reinforced shutters on windows, the disturbed earth behind the main structure. Sheriff Thorne knocked on the cabin door at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Delilah answered after a brief delay, her face showing surprise but not alarm. She wore a simple work dress and apron, her hands dusted with flour. Behind her, the cabin interior looked orderly and domestic, religious verses visible on the walls, the smell of baking bread drifting from the kitchen. Thorne introduced himself and explained they were investigating disappearances of men who had worked logging operations in the region. Delilah's expression shifted to concerned sympathy, inviting the men inside while expressing distress that anyone would think she and her sister had information about such tragedies. Esther emerged from the back room, her face showing the same welcoming hospitality that had lured so many victims. The sheriff asked routine questions about travelers who might have stopped at the homestead. Both sisters answered with practiced ease, acknowledging they occasionally provided food and shelter, but insisting they could recall no one matching descriptions of the missing loggers. When Thorne mentioned Silas Moffat by name, describing a trapper who claimed to have been held captive in a cellar beneath the property, something shifted in the atmosphere. Delilah's welcoming expression froze into something colder. Esther's hands stilled their nervous movement. Thorne stated his intention to search the property, including any cellars or outbuildings. The request was phrased politely, but carried the weight of legal authority that required compliance. Delilah's response came with calculated calm, explaining they had nothing to hide, but questioning whether the sheriff possessed proper warrant for such intrusion. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then she moved with sudden purpose toward the door behind her, and Esther simultaneously reached beneath her apron. Deputy Corrigan recognized the movement, shouting a warning as Delilah produced a shotgun from behind the doorframe where it had been positioned for exactly this contingency. The violence that followed was brief and decisive. Corrigan fired as Delilah brought the weapon to bear, his bullets striking her in the shoulder and spinning her backward. The shotgun discharged into the ceiling, raining splinters and dust. Esther pulled a knife from beneath her apron, lunging toward Thorne with surprising speed and accuracy that suggested she had considered this scenario many times. The sheriff deflected the blade with his forearm, suffering a deep cut, and grabbed Esther's wrist, forcing her to the floor while Aldrich secured the knife. Both sisters were restrained within minutes. Delilah bleeding from her shoulder wound while Dr. Webb worked to staunch the flow. Esther silent and glaring with hatred that seemed to radiate from her like heat. The brief resistance confirmed what Moffat's testimony suggested, that these women were not confused or frightened innocents, but calculating predators who had prepared for the possibility of discovery. With the sisters secured, Thorne turned his attention to the cabin's interior, looking for the concealed entrance Moffat had described. He found it exactly where the trapper had indicated, beneath a heavy rug in the main room, a trapdoor fitted so precisely into the floorboards that it would be invisible to anyone not searching specifically for it. Sheriff Thorne lifted the trapdoor to reveal a ladder descending into darkness. The smell that rose from below was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, decay, and something else that experienced lawmen recognized immediately. The scent of death. Deputy Corrigan lit a lantern and descended first. What he saw in the flickering light made him pause halfway down, his voice tight with controlled horror as he called up that Moffat's testimony had understated rather than exaggerated the truth. The chamber was larger than the trapper had described, extending beyond the initial room into a series of connected spaces carved through bedrock and reinforced with timber supports that suggested years of deliberate construction. The first room contained the chains Moffat had mentioned, heavy iron manacles anchored into limestone walls at intervals that allowed no possibility of one captive reaching another. The stone bore scratches where previous victims had tried to claw their way free. Dark stains on the floor suggested violence that had been repeated many times. Shelves along one wall held implements, whose purposes became horrifyingly clear upon examination. Restraints of various designs, crude medical instruments, bottles containing concentrated sedatives derived from medicinal plants, doses strong enough to render a man unconscious for hours. The second chamber served as living quarters for captives, containing straw mattresses stained with bodily fluids and evidence of long occupation. Personal effects scattered throughout allowed identification of several victims. A distinctive pocket watch belonging to Curtis Bramwell, engraved with his initials. A leather belt with unusual tooling that matched descriptions provided by William Dirth's family. A religious medal that one of the Finnish loggers had worn on a chain around his neck. Each item represented a man who had accepted hospitality at the Kincaid cabin and never left alive. The most damning evidence lay in the third chamber, a smaller space that appeared to serve as the sisters' private archive of their crimes. Here, Thorne found a journal bound in leather, hidden beneath loose floorboards in a metal box that also contained money, jewelry, and valuables. Taken from victims. The journal was written in Delilah's careful hand, documenting 17 separate captivities over 6 years. Dates, names when known, and descriptions that revealed both the scope of their crimes and the twisted psychology that had motivated them. Each entry detailed how the victim had been lured, what methods had been used to subdue him, and observations about his responses to various forms of abuse. Delilah had recorded their practices with clinical precision, noting which techniques proved most effective at breaking a man's will, which forms of deprivation created the most complete dependency, and how long captives typically survived under different treatment protocols. The entries showed no remorse, only the practical observations of someone refining a process through trial and error. The journal also revealed motivations that went beyond simple sadism. Delilah wrote extensively about their father, describing abuse that had taught them to view men as fundamentally weak despite their physical strength, as creatures whose power was illusion that could be stripped away through hunger, isolation, and systematic degradation. She quoted scripture in twisted justifications, comparing their actions to Old Testament passages about divine retribution. Most chilling were the final entries, written just weeks before the raid, where Delilah noted that their practices had become less satisfying over time, that breaking men who were already desperate from starvation provided diminishing returns, and that they had begun considering whether to expand their operations or simply end what had started as catharsis, but had become routine. The full investigation of the Kincaid property required 3 weeks and revealed the remains of 11 victims buried in shallow graves throughout the surrounding woods. Identification proved possible for 8 of the 11 through personal effects and dental characteristics. The remaining 3 could not be identified, suggesting they were transients with no one to report them missing, men whose disappearance into the Ozark wilderness went unnoticed by a world that had already forgotten them. 6 men documented in Delilah's journal were never found. The entries describing their captivity ended abruptly with notes about disposal methods that suggested the sisters had experimented with ways to eliminate evidence more thoroughly than simple burial. The trial of Delilah and Esther Kincaid began on June 5, 1893 in the Stone County Courthouse, drawing national attention as newspapers across the country seized on a story that challenged every assumption about gender, violence, and criminal capability. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Delilah's journal documenting 17 captivities, testimony from Silas Moffat describing his ordeal, physical evidence from the hidden chamber, remains of 11 victims. The defense attempted to argue that the sisters' actions resulted from their father's abuse, that they were victims themselves who had been driven to madness by years of trauma. The argument found some sympathy, but the methodical nature of the sisters' crimes, the careful planning evident in their journal, and the extended timeline that showed escalation rather than isolated acts undermined claims of diminished responsibility. Delilah and Esther had not acted in immediate response to their father's death, but had developed and refined their practices over 6 years, selecting victims strategically and documenting their experimentation with detached precision. Both sisters were convicted of multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and assault. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts that carried mandatory death sentences. Throughout the trial, neither sister showed remorse or acknowledged wrongdoing. In their only public statement before sentencing, delivered by Delilah while Esther stood silent beside her, they claimed they had only done to men what men had always done to women, creating equivalence between their father's abuse and their own systematic torture of 17 victims who had never harmed them. They were hanged on August 4, 1893, before a crowd of over 200 spectators who had traveled from across the region to witness justice carried out. Both women walked to the gallows with composure that observers found disturbing, showing no fear of death and no apparent understanding that their actions warranted the punishment they received. The Kincaid cabin was burned by locals within days of the execution. The community wanted no reminder of what had occurred in the hidden hollow. The property remained unclaimed, eventually reverting to state ownership, and the hollow itself gained a reputation as cursed ground where decent people did not venture. The case influenced criminology and legal proceedings for decades, becoming one of the first documented instances of serial predation by women. It challenged assumptions about violence, gender, and the capacity for evil that exists regardless of sex. A reminder that isolation can transform anyone. That trauma, when it meets opportunity in places where monsters can remain invisible, creates horrors that defy comprehension. This case raises a question that still haunts criminologists today. Can trauma ever justify becoming the monster you once feared? Or does justice end and revenge begin? I want to hear your perspective. Drop your answer in the comments right now. I read every single one. And if this story revealed how easily horror can hide behind hospitality, how desperation makes prey of us all, click that like button. Subscribe because tomorrow we uncover another case where trust became the deadliest weapon. If you made it this far, you're exactly the type of viewer this channel is for. I'll see you in the next investigation.